Hi, folks, and welcome to my tutorial on the basics of interviewing. I want to begin by pointing out that there are several different kinds of interviews that we're all familiar with, but in this tutorial, I'm just going to focus on one kind. For starters, there's what I'm going to call here the gotcha interview that we all recognize, which was really pioneered and made famous by one man, Mike Wallace.
With a little bit additional.
1 second, Frank. We need it with this.
Just another 10 seconds with this machine.
Okay. We going?
We have speed.
Why is the Fox network increasingly popular?
People in America are desperate for straight talk.
And they're not getting it from the networks?
The networks are too stodgy, too traditional. You got to cut through it now.
When I tell people I'm going to do a profile of O'Reilly, oh, wonderful, wonderful. Don't let him off the hook. Go get him. Bring him down. You're the guy who can do it.
What is it about me that offends them?
Take a look at you.
The O'Reilly factor is on.
I'm asking you to shut up about sex. Come on, you coward. Say the truth.
See, I'm more angry about it than you are.
So want to know what I'm doing? Shut up. You had your 35 minutes. Shut up.
That's not an interview. That's a lecture. You say you're a journalist.
Correct.
I say that you're an op-ed columnist, which is different.
No, it's not. You're a dinosaur. You have to engage now. You have to challenge. You have to be so provocative. This is going to embarrass you, Wallace. So are you ready to be embarrassed? Playboy magazine wrote that Bill O'Reilly is the most feared interviewer since Mike Wallace. You were the driving force behind my career. And I always tell everybody, you got a problem with me? He's responsible. So if you don't like me, you go to Wallace.
The mention of my first guest's name has been known to strike fear into the hearts of brave men and women.
I'm Mike Wallace.
I'm Mike Wallace.
I'm Mike Wallace.
I'm Mike
Please
Wallace.
welcome Mike Wallace.
Your image. Interviewer, journalist, killer, all right? This man is gonna get somebody, and we're gonna watch it right here on television.
Do you enjoy gotcha?
You are the master of nailing. You might have even invented nailing somebody on camera with that last question.
How many people did you kill?
5. But I don't think I could kill an innocent person.
What do you mean by an innocent person?
Well, you're an innocent person.
It may just have been that you were difficult, Betty.
No.
Not difficult, impossible. And you're probably unpleasant to him from
You're
the
a son
beginning.
of a bitch. Do you know that?
Oh, come on.
You are a
Barbara.
son of a bitch.
Sync.
You go in to cover a story. It's your camera. It's your microphone. How would you like it done to you?
How long do you think we'll talk?
How would you like somebody to point a camera at you, to confront you with embarrassing material, perhaps about a life you once led or something you once did?
Well, fine, but I don't have to answer them. I think it's a lousy question. You rolling on both?
I mean, does it ever occur to you that what you're doing is somehow, it's a little bit brutalizing? How would you like it done to you?
I wouldn't like it.
Then there's the kind of interview that's not about confrontation, but rather about drawing out good answers and, yes, good dialogue between the interviewer and the source.
Oh, I read your book in one big gobble. It's great. Great read, quick read, and also like right out of the day's headlines. I mean, it's about the pandemic. Very gutsy to write a book before the thing is over, right?
And they call it a post-pandemic world.
Well, yeah, because we see in Europe, it's the pandemic's coming back in the fall. This thing is far from over. Do you worry about that? That there's something's going to happen that be like, ooh, boy, I should have waited.
Well, I think I think I've got it about right in the sense of what I'm talking about is we now understand this, these problems in a way that we didn't, because this is not going to be the last pandemic. And one of the things I talk about in the book is this should be a wake-up call to realize we've been living in a way that is very risky. You know, if you think about the way in which we are spewing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere
and eating,
the way we eat, I talk about the factory farms. Factory farms are essentially a petri dish for the next pandemic. You're just going to create larger and larger, more powerful viruses. The way we subsidize people to live at the edges of forests. So, you know, so I feel as though we've got, you know, and it's like we're driving the fastest race car in the world, and we're like, who needs seatbelts? Who needs insurance?
But you know, that what you're really saying is we need to learn.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're the learn species, really. I mean, my question to you is, I hate to say this because it sounds so pessimistic, but I don't think one is going to do it. In other words, one pandemic. I don't think we're going to change after one. I think it's going to take more than one, because people are just going to go, oh, that was a fluke. Thank God 2020 is over. We're back to normal. I don't see less cheeseburgers being eaten.
Well, take a look at what has happened in East Asia.
Both these examples show interviews as a highly performative kind of art, and that's what we so often recognize them to be and how we tend to understand them. But in this tutorial, I want to focus on the interviewing journalists do every day that isn't a performance. This is the interviewing they do in the field to gather their material for news and feature stories. For these interviews, the reporters aren't concerned about how they might look or sound to masses of people. They're focused on their sources and on their stories. So with that in mind, I want to talk about some of the basic principles of that kind of interviewing. First of all, as with any kind of interviewing, performative or not, you want to be very, very much prepared when you go in. And so a lot of what interviewing is all about is about the preparation. Secondly, as soon as you do connect with your source, you want to establish a real rapport or a real connection. Third, you want to obviously ask questions that are going to really open up and gather the best results for your story. And third, and this is at least as important as any of the others, if not the most important, interviewing is really about listening and watching attentively and then responding accordingly, because you are listening and watching attentively. So we'll get into all of that, but to begin with, let's talk about getting set up, or what I'm going to call a workflow, getting organized to do stories. And this is important because stories can get pretty challenging and pretty complicated.
I was told that the police department is having trouble keeping the troopers' horses healthy. Yeah. Yeah, I hear there's bowel trouble. Constipation. I have you on record working in Nicaragua with John Cullen and Barry Reed between 81 and 85.
Yeah, I worked with Reed, but I don't know Cullen.
You have any contact info for Reed?
Last I heard, he was in New Orleans. I think he died, though.
Well, I'd like to review your flight logs, names of pilots.
I can't do that as well.
Is there anyone else I can speak to?
I don't know, maybe try back in a week. Talk to my boss.
Is Cullen residing in Lake City?
Florida, maybe. Look, I can't talk to you.
In fact, even the most basic stories are going to be challenging at first, as you learn to juggle chasing sources with managing and incorporating all the information that the sources provide you. So it's crucial to start by developing good habits and a good system, or what I'm calling here a workflow, for your efforts. I'd start by what we call checking the clips. And that means you want to find out what kind of news coverage is already out there. And that's once you begin to develop an idea, of course, you want to go look and see what kind of coverage there is. The next thing you want to do is try and think of all of the potential sources that might work for the story. And that's going to involve you thinking about what are my basic questions, who would be the best to answer them, and then going over the clips themselves and seeing in the past coverage, what kinds of people did the reporters reach out to? And can I follow up with either some of the people they already talked to, or just as often, or maybe more often, what kinds of other people, like the people that they talk to, might I talk to? Then you want to start to compile, just as you saw in that video there, all the names of these people and their contact information. And you want to keep a kind of a log as you go through of who you've contacted, where you're at with each source, who you've left a message with, and all that kind of thing, so that you make sure that you're keeping track of it all. So then the next step is to develop your actual story idea. Now, I've talked about this with you all in the past, but what I've suggested is basically what I've called doing a pre-interview interview, where you actually reach out to some of your initial ideas for sources, and ask them to help you, kind of invite them in as you develop your story idea. But again, that's an interview in and of itself. So you want to prepare for even your pre-interview interview, just so that they'll talk to you and take you seriously. But in the readings that I've had you do, Always Get the Name of the Dog by Nicole Kraft, she recommends thinking about the story you're trying to develop in these ways. First of all, try and focus and get some clarity about what the story is about. Secondly, think about all the different ways that you might want to tell the story, how many different angles there are. So in other words, how many different stories there might be about the topic that you first came up with. And then think about which of these might make the best sense to pursue right away. Now, you maybe don't have to get fixated on that like it's carved in stone, but you do want to have a real sense of what direction or what piece of this, the topic you really want to cover and how you want to cover it. And then you want to think about what people will be the best sources, and then you get into what are you going to ask them. So the big early step in there then is to think about what is a good source, which are going to be your good sources for the story. And as you think that through, there's a couple of different considerations to keep in mind. I'd start with this issue of asking yourself what I'm going to call the 5 W questions. Now, what do we mean by 5 W's? There's that old cliche in journalism: who, what, when, where, and why. But what I really mean by that is, what are the most basic things that people have to understand about what you're writing about? So another way to put that, which is how Nicole Kraft puts it in her book, is the goal for every article is to think about the question readers have and get the answers for them before the readers even think to ask. So again, just you need to sort of step back, think big picture, and think, what are the basic, most essential things here? And then an important part of that is, along with it, what are the most important facts? What's the foundation of actual objective information that makes me understand that it's true? And as I'm beginning to think this through, it's really important to question, is there something that maybe I have the whole premise wrong? For example, a student once told me that they wanted to do a story about this huge trend in new bubble tea places that are cropping up all over Honolulu. Well, she immediately had to ask herself, do I know that there's a trend of bubble tea places, or is that just my impression? And how can I test that? How can I find out if there are really more now than there were a year ago? So what you want to be careful not to do is to go galloping off on a false assumption, because then the whole story is going to be wrong just at its foundation. But then the next step or the next stage of this is to think about what you really want to know. So you know, beyond just the basics, what are some of the aspects of it that you really want to draw out in your reporting? What's going to really make this story pop and be interesting and be worthwhile both to you and to the public? And when you think about this, one of the things to keep in mind is, you know, well, to go back for a second, let's use the example of inter-island travel, okay? So for the example that we did in class, I asked everyone to consider how they would travel to another island right now in the middle of the pandemic. What do people need to know in order to plan and book their trip? How does one get a test to avoid quarantine? How many places are providing testing? How hard is it to book a test? Do you still have to be eligible in order to get a test in the first place? Are the tests free, or how much do they cost? If I travel from Oahu to Maui, do I then have to take another test once I'm in Maui in order to get back home? Actually, the answer is you don't, because Oahu isn't requiring tests for travelers from other islands. But that wasn't an easy answer to find out. Developing those questions then helps us develop a list of sources. We would want to talk maybe to the Hawaii Department of Transportation, the airlines, the different companies contracted with the state to provide the testing to allow travelers to skip the quarantine. And maybe there are some other basics that we figure out are going to help us with these basic questions. Nicole Kraft gives an example of somebody working on a story about a local college that has implemented a new policy of assigning roommates. In this case, basic questions would be, what was the old policy? What made the school decide to change? What were problems with the old policy? So these are basic questions. And then when we look at the question of what do we really want to know, what would make this maybe the best story, who are our sources, or what kind of an angle we're going to take, let's go back to the inter-island travel example again for a second. Maybe we want to take another angle on inter-island travel and focus on the frustrations and confusions that people are experiencing with this. In that case, we'd want to find residents who are trying to plan a trip. Maybe we can find someone who needs to visit family, or maybe we can find someone who's gotten stuck at their destination and had trouble returning to their home island, or someone who missed a flight because of the bureaucracy or faced some other kind of hassle. In the example that Nicole Kraft gives, she says, I'd love to read about other people's misery. Can we get some anecdotes about how the new or old roommate system has gone wrong? Then, you know, for finding the right source, Kraft points out, it's one thing to find someone who lives on campus, and another thing to find someone who actually has a roommate. But if you really want to find someone, but what you really want to do is find someone who's been assigned a roommate, right? No other kind of source is going to be appropriate for this kind of thing. So there's a general rule of thumb that's also maybe worth illustrating with an anecdote, okay? And that's that you always want to get people who are closest to the source, to the story. The best sources are always going to be the ones closest to the action. And by that, I don't necessarily only mean literally the action, although, you know, if it's a story about crime, you may want to be talking to the cop who was on the street that night. And if it's a story in a broader sense about crime or about the violence that's happening in a certain neighborhood, maybe you want to talk about to the one guy, the criminologist who's looked deepest into that neighborhood or into the kinds of crimes that are happening in that neighborhood. But to give an example from my own experience of this, I was once covering a rescue for a near drowning. And I showed up and there was a dock. And I was walking up the dock, and there was a gaggle of emergency responders and reporters that were all in kind of a cluster talking, and they were giving kind of an official talk to the press. And it was a bit of a narrow dock, but it seemed like kind of a crowd. And as a reporter, I I always knew to kind of avoid the crowds. There's a whole other rationale behind that. But I just knew that I didn't need to follow the mob in order to get the story. And so what I simply did was I just walked around this little group of them on the dock, and I kept walking to the end of the dock. And at the end of the dock, there was a boat. And so I walked over to the people sitting in the boat, and I said to them, "Do you know anything about this near drowning and the rescue that happened here?" And the guy in the boat said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm the one who pulled the kid out of the water and saved him." And so while all the press was back talking to the police and the officials that were there to give kind of their reports of the story, I was actually talking to the people who had done the rescue. So again, it's really important to find the people closest to the action. And then the other 2 points I would make, just to finish up on all this, is that you want variety. Okay, you want not just pro and con. They say there's two sides to every story. Really, there's multiple sides to every story, and that's what you want. You want different ways of looking at something because it's interesting and because it's the most informative way to cover something. And then finally, one of the ways that you're really going to need to work to develop sources is you're always going to need to ask sources for names of other sources. So quite often, it's not the first source you talk to who's the best. It's maybe not even the second. It might be the third or the fourth. But so you have to keep kind of walking it down the chain in order to really find the best people for your story. So then the next thing to keep in mind is preparing for the story. Once you've identified your sources, you want to prepare for talking to them before you pick up a phone or start to write to them. And so one of the first ways to think about this is just in terms of basic research, okay? So I would say to some extent, you got to start somewhere. So it's fine to just catch a wide net, cast a wide net. You know, start with Google, start with Wikipedia. In fact, you know, the broader the picture, in some ways, when you're getting started, the better, because that way you don't miss anything and you get sort of broadly familiar with what you're talking about, rather than trying to start by looking at it through a straw hole. And then again, this gets back to check the clips, right? Look at the news coverage from the past and present. It's really not a story if the press has already been on it. So you want to find stories that nobody's reported yet. Maybe it's just the next step in the reporting that's already gone on, but you want to be there to pick up the ball and bring it to where it goes next. Now, in these days, you definitely want to check with social media. They can be an excellent source. And in fact, with what we call crowdsourcing, social media is an important source in itself. So if you're working on a story about, you know, something that might be fairly obscure, some new technique in surfing, or something like that, you may want to blast out something on social media, say, "Hey, I'm working on a story about this. Is there anyone who has some special familiarity with it that's willing to talk to me?" And a lot of times you get great results that way. And then finally, there's the issue of, you know, where do you find the expert information? So through our library, you can use Google Scholar, and I mean, anybody can use Google Scholar, but the advantage you have of being at a university library is that if it does, and when it does pull up scholarly studies of things, you have access to many of them. You also want to look at specialized blogs and websites, ones that have targeted audiences, forums where people who are really in the know about a specific topic are talking about it. And then there's the data and the documents. So many things in our lives today leave paper trails. And one of the things I would emphasize about this is that that you can really find a lot of your best stories by going through pretty dry documents. I found stories about the occult in data and in documents. I found stories about a $350 million Congo gorilla forest that nobody else had known about in the Bronx Zoo by going through the City of New York budget report. So you can find all kinds of things that way. And then of course there's books on whatever topic you're looking at. Now, does that mean necessarily you need to go off and do a big scholarly research project before you pick up the phone and talk to your first source? No, you don't, but you want to try to be as up to snuff as possible, and so that you can do the best journalism as possible. As far as, you know, best ways to prepare, there's a more sort of philosophical way of looking at this. Just to read out loud the quotes here that I've got. It's really about, again, making that personal connection, right? The preparation is the same whether you're going to interview a diplomat, a jockey, or an itchy thiologist. From the person, you learn what, from the person's past, you learn what questions are likely to stimulate a response. And the research serves three purposes. It gives the reporter leads to tentative themes and to specific questions. It provides the reader with a feel, the reporter with a feel for the subject, and it provides useful background or context. So in other words, in a broad sense, you really want to prepare for the interview by anticipating and, you know, do the research in order to anticipate what kind of answers you might be able to get, what kind of a person you're dealing with, what they may know, what they may respond best to, how they may respond, that kind of thing. Now, in terms of developing your questions, what I usually would do is before any interview, after I've done my research, I would just brainstorm ideas for questions. And along those lines, I would ask several kinds. First of all, as I've said, you want to really be thinking about those 5 W questions: who, what, when, where, and why. What are the basics that I absolutely have to understand and that the reader has to understand in order for all this to make sense? So another way to put that is, what do I absolutely need to find out from this interview? If you're on a tight deadline, like if you're working at a daily paper and you have time that day before your deadline to just interview, you know, 3 or 4 different people, and you finally get a chance to talk to one of them, and you know they're not going to be available later on, and you got to write this story, you really have to think carefully about, what do I absolutely need? Because if this person walks away and I can't get back in touch with them, I'm just not even, my story is not even really going to make sense, or it's not going to be very good, because it's just going to, something about it is going to be too unknown or too questionable. And what Nicole Kraft says about this, which is a good line, and it really gets at the point, is that good reporters live by the adage, I don't know what I don't know. So part of thinking about what are the basics that I really have to understand is having some humility about this and realize there may be things that I need to understand that I don't even know that I need to understand yet. So when you talk to sources, you have to be kind of very cognizant of that, is that often as reporters, you're jumping into a new topic every day. We're known as real generalists. So one day you might be doing something about NASA and the space program, and the next day you might be covering a crime story or something about food. So, you know, that happens a lot. And so you just kind of have to have a sensitivity to knowing that there's lots that you don't know, and making sure that you ask when you're around sources to fill you in. You also want to think about if what you're trying to get is good quotes and good responses, good insight, you know, the good stuff that you get from a personal interview, what will get this person beyond the kind of the mask that they put up. I mean, this is akin to what we were practicing with the photography when we photograph people. How do you get beyond the mask that they put up when you go to take their picture? And then in terms of how to organize your list of questions, start with the basics and start with the easy, the softball questions first. You definitely want to save the really tough questions, the ones that you know might make them angry, for last, because if you ask the ones that are going to make them angry first, then they may hang up with you and then you don't get the rest of the information. Another point is make sure you're not just simply asking yes or no questions. And finally, and this is really the most important thing, is that as you're brainstorming this bunch of questions, it's a list, right? It's not a script. You don't want to walk in and follow a script. And to that point, Katie Couric explains that, I think, really well.
How do you prepare for an interview?
Well, I try to do a combination of explaining what I can in the body of the question without going on and on. And I try to ask questions, obviously, that don't require a yes or no answer, because that's a disaster, because you're left kind of with a lot of dead air. And depending on who I'm talking to, I fashion my questions that way. And I sometimes go through them and think, well, how is this person likely to answer this? And what would be an appropriate follow-up? And knowing what they've said in previous interviews or their positions on various issues, I think, well, how can I go at this another way? Sometimes it happens spontaneously, obviously, when someone doesn't answer your questions. But at other times, I think you can predict appropriate follow-up questions.
It might sound a little bit Captain Obvious, but listening is probably really important, right?
Very, very. Nothing is worse for me than as a viewer to watch someone go down a laundry list of questions and not explore something with a little more depth after someone has answered a question already, to not pick up on something, maybe an inconsistency or something that may be news, and follow up on that and use that as the springboard to go into a whole different area. I think you need to use your questions as sort of a template, but you have to be willing to listen, as you said, Tony, and really veer off in a totally different direction. I can't stand it when people don't have the ability to do that. I'm like, it makes me crazy.
Now, that being said, have you ever had an interview go pretty far south?
So that is really key, and a really important skill, to be attentive and to not miss it when somebody says something that in fact breaks news, or when in fact they go in an unexpected and really fascinating direction. And you want to be able to follow that. And so that takes some practice, but at the end of the day, what it really requires is both being attentive and listening carefully, and showing that to them so that they will open up and give you those things. And also that you're quick on your feet. And so when somebody does something like that, you pick up on it and you're ready to pivot and to follow them in an important direction that you really didn't anticipate that when you first walked into the interview. Okay, so once you've done your research and you've developed your questions, then you're ready to reach out. Now, as you get more experienced, you may be able to reach out at an earlier stage because you'll be better at dealing with it when you first call the person, all of a sudden they're ready to do the interview. But you do want to be careful that when you first reach out to people, you're ready to do the interview right away. One thing that I learned from doing reporting over the years is that sometimes when you first call somebody, within the first several seconds of talking to them, they will blurt out the most important things that they will ever have to say to you about a story. And after that, they start to think about it and they become more guarded. But so you really have to be ready from the moment they pick up the phone to catch whatever it is they may have to tell you, because they may not be willing to say it again. And if you don't get it down the first time, you may think you're just calling them up to arrange an interview, but what they say may be the most newsworthy thing that they have to say from the moment they answer the phone. But just regarding beyond that, regarding the tips that I have for once you are ready to reach out to sources is, don't rely on email. That's a classic mistake that student journalists do at the beginning. And then what happens is that people don't get back to you. They ignore the email because they don't know you and because they're busy. And then what ends up happening is you don't get your story and you don't meet your deadlines. What I would recommend is call. Often people won't answer their phone. That's fairly typical these days. I would leave voicemail. Some people leave text messages. Other people find that unprofessional. But in addition to the call and the voicemail, I would send an email. And then what would be a good idea would be if you don't hear back quickly, don't be discouraged. A lot of times it's a good idea to wait maybe just a day and then call again so that they see that that you're that you're serious and that you're really trying to reach them and that it's important. You might want to send a second email at that point. What you want to do from the get-go is make sure you're clear in identifying yourself and why you're calling. If you're able to do this for a publication, then I would identify obviously who you're doing it for. But the main thing is to explain that you're a student journalist and that you're working on a story and what your story is about. And you want to provide people with right away, when you leave your message, with a realistic deadline. You don't want to give them the deadline when your story is actually due. You want to give them the deadline when would be the latest that you'd be able to do the interview and still be able to use it for the story. And then regarding these follow-up interviews, voicemails or emails, the rule of thumb would just be to be persistent, be proactive, but don't be annoying, obviously. And an important part of success here is sounding clear and confident and like you know what you're doing, like a pro. So in terms of arranging it, the best kind of interview will be in person, and you really want to think about, if you're doing it with sound in audio interview, then there are obvious considerations that you need to think about specifically for quality sound, okay? But beyond that, you want to think about, where is this source going to feel the most comfortable? Maybe at home, maybe at their favorite hangout. You want to think through where's going to be the best environment where they're really going to open up and talk to you. And that also might involve, if you're talking to a woodworker, you might want to meet them in their wood shop so that when they're explaining what they do, they can show you their work right there. If you can't do it in person, and during the pandemic, obviously that's a unique challenge, the second best option would be Zoom or over the phone. I would say second best would be Zoom and third best would be over the phone, although you can certainly do very substantial, very excellent interviews over the phone. What I would discourage you from doing, but a lot of sources will try and steer you towards, is doing an email interview where they'll say, oh, well, just provide me your questions via email and I'll respond to it. If they do that, what you're going to get is not really an interview. You're going to get these canned, carefully prepared, lifeless responses that aren't going to be useful for quotes in your story. Quotes in stories give the story flavor. And so that's really what you're looking for when you do, when you're pulling out quotes, when you're doing these interviews. You're looking for the stuff that's really quotable and that's going to give, like adding spices to your cooking. So you should also understand a couple of key terms here, off the record and on background. Now, when you call someone, when you approach someone and you say, I'm a reporter, and you ask them a question, at that point, everything from there on is officially on the record. Anything they say is on the record. What off the record means is that they want to tell you something that you cannot use in your story. You can't use it at all. You're supposed to file it in your back of your mind. Maybe it leads you in a certain direction. But when they say this is off the record, that doesn't mean you can put it into the story unattributed. It means that you can't have it in your story. The rule with that is that They need to say, before they tell you anything, is it okay if we go off the record now? If they don't say that, then you're still on the record. Now, can there be leniency if you're talking to someone, say some lower level employee somewhere who just isn't media savvy, and it ends up saying something that could get them in really deep trouble with their jobs or their lives, and some of it can have terrible costs, and they say, oh, I meant that to be off the record, can you please not publish that? Then the ethics dictate that yes, you want to be, you want to be sensitive to that and agree with that. You don't want to be ruthless in those cases, because that's not good journalism. That's unethical. On the other hand, if the source is someone who's either a public figure, who's used to being out in public and has kind of volunteered themselves for that life, where it's a choice, or especially in cases where someone is a public official, in other words, a politician or a state or city employee who really should know better, not just some lower level person, but say the sheriff or a manager or something like that. If they say something and then they say, oh no, I want that off the record, you're less obligated by journalistic ethics to give them a break. They're supposed to know better. And so keep that in mind. And then there's this idea of on background, okay? And what on background means is that you can use the actual information in the story, but it would be without attribution. Now, at this level, as you start out, you really don't want unattributed information. I know that a lot of the national press is filled with stuff by anonymous sources, but that's not really good at all in terms of good reporting or reliable reporting or transparent reporting. So you don't want to immediately get into a habit of trying to trade in unattributed anonymous sourcing. And the other point I would just make is that if somebody goes and tells you something off the record, generally what reporters will do is they'll try the way that getting off the record information is useful is that then it exists, it's out there. And so then you can try and find a source who will tell you about it on the record. If you are using on background information from someone who wants to go anonymously, again, I discourage you from doing that with your early stories. I mean, that's something that really you can worry about down the road. But what you would do in those cases is we would try to find other independent sources to corroborate what this one person is telling you. Because if they're telling you something on background, they say, don't use my name, but use it in the story, it could be totally untrue. It could be slander. They could have an agenda for why they want to sneak that in there. And so you want to be very careful with anonymous sourced or unattributed information that you put in your stories. And then just to conclude, whenever you do an interview, make sure you show up dressed for the right kind of interview. So if it's at a construction site or somewhere informal like that, or a bar or whatever, you're going to dress very differently than if you're talking to some executive. And you really want to put people at ease. So when you walk in and you get going, just make sure. I mean, an interview is in many ways just a conversation. It's an organized conversation, but it's a conversation all the same. And having said all of that, when it comes to the interview itself and how you make that connection, let me leave you again with Katie Couric, because she does a very good job of talking about that.
Question would be, what makes somebody a good interviewer?
Well, I think it's really important, Tony, to be a gracious host, because I think the more comfortable you make someone feel, the better interview you'll ultimately get. So I know that in terms of body language, I always try to be very warm and welcoming. And I think it's really critical to put someone at ease. I think also you have to calibrate your tone depending on what interview you're doing. If I'm talking to David Duke about, anti-Semitism or racism, obviously I'll have a very different tone. I'll be much more pugnacious than I would be when I'm talking to someone who may have suffered a personal tragedy. So I think it's really important to be very empathetic in some cases, and then to know when you're going to be loaded for bear and really try to elicit important information from someone who may be a bit oily and not direct in answering your questions.
How do you prepare for an interview?
Well, I try to do a
Okay, and that's pretty much everything. I hope you found this helpful. Please give me feedback on how I can improve these videos. Thanks.